speaker Illyra Tesh had not slept in 6 days. She stood at the edge of the observation deck, in the last functioning government tower on Teshin 4, watching the sky burn orange, where the Keth orbital strikes had scorched the upper atmosphere into something ugly and wrong. The floating coral forests that had once drifted like slow pink clouds over the capital plateau were gone now, reduced to ash and falling dust that coated everything in a fine gray layer that tasted like grief. Behind her, the emergency command center hummed with the quiet desperation of people who had run out of options. The screens showed population maps covered in red zones, infrastructure reports filled with the word destroyed, and a countdown timer that no one wanted to look at, but everyone kept glancing toward. 9 standard rotations until the Keth Dominion's second fleet arrived. 9 rotations until whatever was left of their world became raw material for alien factories. Illyra was Vaylari, which meant she stood tall and thin, with hollow bones built for a low-gravity world. Her feathered crest, once a deep violet that signaled confidence and authority, had faded to a dull gray over the past weeks. Her large, dark eyes, designed to see in the bioluminescent twilight of her world's coral forests, now stared at destruction they were never meant to witness. 900 million survivors. That was the number they had confirmed as of this morning. 900 million people hiding in underground shelters, huddled in the ruins of cities, waiting in refugee columns that stretched across broken highways leading nowhere. Every one of them looking to her for answers she did not have. Her military advisor Dunal stepped up beside her. His own crest was flat against his skull, the Vaylari equivalent of a permanent frown. He carried a datapad, and his expression told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. "The Sholan Collective has formally declined," he said, and his voice was steady in the way that voices become steady when the person speaking has already processed their anger and come out the other side into something colder. "They say our system falls outside their jurisdictional mandate." Illyra closed her eyes. "And the Mavathi Accord? Resource allocation concerns. They expressed sympathy and offered to send a cultural preservation team to archive our history and genetic records." He paused. "In case we do not survive." "How generous of them." "The Assembly of Concord has not responded at all. It has been 11 days. Illyra turned from the window. She looked at the room full of exhausted people working at consoles, talking into communication devices, trying to coordinate the impossible task of keeping a civilization alive when the ground beneath it had been ripped away. Every face she saw reflected the same truth they all knew, but no one wanted to say out loud. They were alone. 3 galactic powers, each one capable of intervening, each one choosing not to. Not because they could not help, but because helping was inconvenient. The Keth Dominion had a powerful military and useful trade agreements, and no one wanted to risk those things for a species of hollow-boned diplomats who had never threatened anyone. Illyra walked to the central communication console. The operator there, a young woman whose left arm was wrapped in burn bandages, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Open a channel," Illyra said. "Broadband diplomatic frequency." Duanel's crest twitched. "To whom?" "The Terran Continuity Government." The silence in the room was immediate and total. Even the background hum of machines seemed to pause. Every person in that room turned to look at their speaker, with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. Duanel stepped closer and lowered his voice. "The humans?" "Yes. Illyra, we have never had direct diplomatic contact with them. Are a Class 7 species on the Galactic Volatility Index. The Sholan Collective once described them as a civilization permanently on the edge of either saving everything or destroying everything. The Sholan Collective also just told us to die quietly," Illyra said. "I am open to new relationships. The humans are unpredictable. They are emotional and territorial, and they respond to threats with disproportionate force." Every species that has dealt with them closely has stories that they tell in whispers. The Mavathi say they are insane. The Assembly calls them unnecessary chaos. And yet no one has ever accused them of ignoring someone who asked for help. Dunel opened his mouth to argue, and then closed it again, because she was right. In every report, every cultural briefing, every second-hand account from species who had interacted with the Terran government, one detail appeared again and again, like a thread woven through everything humans did. Help. Humans came. They did not always come wisely or carefully, or with a plan that made sense to anyone else. But they came. We are asking for shelter, Illyra said. Temporary housing for civilian populations until we can arrange a more permanent solution. That is all. We are not asking them to fight our war. We are not asking them to be our saviors. We are asking for a roof over the heads of our children. She turned to the communications operator. Open the channel. The young woman's fingers moved across the console. The channel opened with a soft hum that connected Teshin 4 to the broader galactic communication network, and from there to the Terran diplomatic relay stationed in the Orion Transit Corridor. Illyra spoke clearly and simply. She identified herself and her world. She described the situation without exaggeration because the truth was terrible enough. She listed the 3 powers who had declined to help, not as an accusation, but as context. She explained what they needed: temporary shelter, basic supplies, a safe place to put civilians while they figured out their next step. She ended the transmission, and the room was quiet. Dunel stared at the console. They probably will not even respond. The humans have their own problems. They are half a galaxy away. They have no treaty with us, no trade agreement, no strategic interest in this system. The communications officer suddenly sat up straighter. Her eyes went wide, and her bandaged hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her equipment. Speaker Tesh, she said, and her voice cracked. We have a response. Dunel checked the timestamp on the transmission log. The reply had come in under 2 hours. In galactic diplomacy, most formal responses took days or weeks. The fastest Illyra had ever received was 14 hours, and that had been an emergency. That is not possible, Dunel said. Put it through, Illyra said. The message filled the room, transmitted in clean galactic standard, with a Terran accent that made the vowels harder and the consonants sharper. Velari Conclave, this is Terran Continuity Government's Humanitarian Command. Your shelter request is acknowledged. Dispatching TCG Humanitarian Action Group 7 to your coordinates. Estimated arrival, 31 standard hours. Prepare landing zones for 12 vessels. We are bringing builders, medical teams, and protective escort. Do not worry about specifics. We are bringing everything. Hold on, we are coming. The message ended. The room was silent. Illyra read the message again on the screen, focusing on 2 words that she did not fully understand in this context. Protective escort. She looked at Dunel. His crest feathers had gone completely flat against his skull, pressed so tight they almost disappeared. His eyes were fixed on the screen, and for the first time since the war began, she saw something in his expression that was not exhaustion or anger. Grief. It was fear. They are not just sending shelter, he said quietly. No, Illyra agreed. They are sending warships. It appears so. We did not ask for warships. Illyra looked out the window at the burning sky and the falling ash, and the broken remains of a world that 3 galactic powers had decided was not worth saving. She thought about 900 million people waiting for someone, anyone, to tell them that help was coming. No, she said, we did not ask, but perhaps someone finally decided to answer the question we were too afraid to ask. 31 hours. The countdown began. The first thing the Velari noticed was the sound. It came 31 hours after the transmission, exactly on schedule. A deep rolling thunder that started at the edge of the atmosphere and grew louder until it shook the ground beneath their feet. The refugees in the plateau camps looked up with terror in their eyes, because the last time sound had come from the sky, it had brought fire and death. Children pressed against their parents, and the old ones covered their heads, and everyone waited for the end to come again. But the sound was different this time. It was not the sharp crack of orbital bombardment or the high whine of Keth attack drones. It was deeper, steadier, like a heartbeat made of engines. Illyra stood on the cleared landing zone at the edge of the capital plateau, with Dunel beside her and a small honor guard behind her. She had wanted to meet the humans formally, with what little dignity her broken government could still present. Maybe two, carrying supplies and a small diplomatic team. 12 ships dropped through the clouds in tight formation. They came down in a pattern that looked almost like a flower opening, the larger vessels in the center and the smaller ones spiraling outward, to take positions around the plateau. The 4 biggest ships were massive boxy things covered in mechanical arms and cargo doors that were already opening before the landing struts touched the ground. 3 medium-sized vessels had the clean white markings of medical ships, with red crosses painted on their hulls so large they could be seen from the refugee camps below. And then there were the 5 warships. They did not land. They took up positions in the sky above the plateau, hovering at different altitudes, in a pattern that Dunel immediately recognized as a defensive combat formation. Their hulls were dark gray and angular, built not for beauty, but for the single purpose of ending anything that threatened what was below them. The largest one had a name painted on its side in white letters that Illyra could read even from the ground. TSS Lullaby. She did not understand why a warship would be named after something so gentle. Dunel understood. He said nothing, but his crest pressed even flatter. The first person to step off the lead ship was a human woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and a face that carried scars the way some people carry medals. She wore a uniform that was practical and worn, and she walked with the confident stride of someone who had done this many times before. Behind her came a flood of humans in different uniforms, some carrying tools, some carrying medical equipment, some carrying things Illyra could not identify, all of them moving with a speed and purpose that seemed almost frantic. The woman crossed the landing zone and stopped in front of Illyra. She looked up at the taller Velari leader and extended her hand. Colonel Marin Voss, Terran, Continuity Government, Humanitarian Action Group 7, she said. You must be Speaker Tesh. Illyra took her hand carefully. The human grip was warm and firm and surprisingly gentle. Colonel Voss, on behalf of the Velari Conclave, I wish to formally express our deepest gratitude for your response to our... You can thank us when your kids are sleeping under a solid roof, Voss said, and her voice was kind, but her eyes were already scanning the destruction behind Illyra. Cataloging damage, calculating needs. Right now, show me where the worst damage is. Illyra blinked. The interaction had lasted less than 30 seconds. The humans were already unloading. Within the first hour, Illyra understood what the message had meant by everything. The 4 fabrication ships carried modular habitat units that could be assembled in minutes by teams of human engineers, who worked with a coordination that seemed almost mechanical, but was powered by something far more alive. They carried water purification systems capable of cleaning an entire river in hours. They carried atmospheric scrubbers that could filter the toxic particles from the bomb sky. They carried soil restoration drones that would begin healing the poisoned ground. They carried food production units and power generators and communication arrays and 1,000 other things that the Velari desperately needed and had stopped daring to hope for. The medical frigates were even more astonishing. A tall man with dark skin and calm eyes introduced himself as Dr. Ao Okonkwo, Chief Medical Officer. He carried a datapad in one hand, and with the other he offered Illyra something small and wrapped in brown paper. Chocolate, he said. It is a human food. It helps when things are difficult. Illyra took it and stared at it, and did not know what to say. Dr. Okonkwo's medical teams moved into the refugee camps with a quiet efficiency that was almost unsettling. They had used the 31 hours of travel time to download and study every available piece of information about Velari biology, physiology, common diseases, nutritional requirements, and developmental needs. They arrived not as strangers fumbling with alien anatomy, but as professionals who had done their homework. Within 3 hours, they had set up field hospitals. Within 4, they were treating radiation burns that the Velari's own medics had not had the equipment to properly address. Within 5, they had identified a parasitic infection spreading through the refugee camps that Velari medicine had missed entirely because they lacked the diagnostic tools to detect it. "How did you learn our biology so quickly?" Illyra asked Dr. Okonkwo. He looked up from his datapad with a slight smile. "We did not learn it quickly. We learned it thoroughly. There is a difference. We had 31 hours. We used every single one of them." But it was the gunships that Illyra kept looking at. They hung in the sky like dark guardian spirits, silent and watchful. Their sensors swept the space around Teshin 4 in overlapping patterns that left no gap, no blind spot. The lead ship, the Lullaby, occasionally adjusted its position with small, precise movements that reminded Ilra of a predator tracking something only it could see. Dunel approached Colonel Voss as the sun began to set over the plateau, casting long shadows across the growing field of new shelters that had not existed 6 hours ago. "Colonel," he said carefully, "we requested shelter. You have brought shelter, and we are grateful beyond words. But we did not request military protection. Why the warships?" Voss was watching a team of engineers fitting insulation panels to a row of habitat units. She did not look at Dunel when she answered, but her voice carried a weight that made him listen with every feather on his body. "Because someone made you need shelter," she said. Was quiet for a long time. "You do not know us," he said finally. "You have no treaty with us. No obligation, no debt. We are strangers to you. Why would you send your warships to protect strangers?" Voss turned to look at him then, and her scarred face held an expression that Dunel had never seen on any alien species before. It was not pity, and it was not strategy, and it was not the cold calculation of political advantage. It was something older and simpler and far more dangerous. "Because you asked for help," she said, "and we heard you. That is enough. That has always been enough." Above them, the Lullaby shifted position again. Its sensors swept the dark edge of the system where the Keth fleet would come from in 7 days. The ship said nothing. It simply watched and waited. In the camps below, the first Velari children were being led into completed shelters. Small hands touched solid walls for the first time in weeks. One child, a tiny girl with a cracked crest and dust in her feathers, pressed her palm flat against the warm surface of a habitat panel and made a sound that her mother had not heard in a month. She laughed. And somewhere in the sky above, 5 human warships kept watch over a world that was not their own, protecting people they had never met, because a species halfway across the galaxy had asked for shelter, and the humans had decided that shelter meant safety, and safety meant everything. Colonel Voss looked up at the darkening sky and the silent gunships, and the first stars appearing through the thinning haze of destruction. "Get some rest, Speaker Tesh," she said quietly to Illyra. "We have a lot of work to do tomorrow, and every day after that, until this is finished." "Until what is finished?" Illyra asked. Voss smiled, and it was the kind of smile that carried the weight of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and the cold emptiness of space, and had somehow come out the other side. "Still willing to build shelters for strangers until your people are safe," she said. "All of them." On the second day, Sergeant Priya Anand was welding a support beam on Habitat Row 12 when she heard a sound she did not recognize. It was soft and high-pitched, somewhere between a whistle and a hum, and it came from behind a pile of construction materials. She put down her welding torch and walked around the pile, and found 7 Velari children sitting in a tight circle on the ground. They were small, the tallest one barely reaching her waist, with feathered crests that should have been bright with color, but were dull and flat. Their large, dark eyes watched her approach with a mixture of curiosity and fear that she had seen before, in other places on other worlds, in the eyes of children who had learned too young that the universe was not safe. One of them, the smallest, was making the sound. Priya would later learn it was a Velari distress call, a frequency that young ones produced unconsciously when they felt afraid and alone. Priya sat down on the ground. Not tower over them. She did not approach, she just sat and waited. The children stared at her. The smallest one stopped humming. The silence stretched between 2 species that had never met, separated by biology and culture and the vast emptiness of space, connected by something much simpler. Priya reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a handful of colorful building clips that she used for joining smaller panels together. She held them out in her open palm and smiled. The bravest child, a boy with a cracked crest and one eye swollen shut from an injury that was still healing, reached out and took one. He turned it over in his small fingers, examining it. Then he clipped it to the edge of his tattered clothing and looked up at Priya with an expression that was almost a question. She took another clip and attached it to her own collar. Then she pointed at his and pointed at hers and gave him a thumbs up. He did not know what a thumbs up meant, but he understood the feeling behind it. His crest twitched upward by a fraction of an inch. By the end of the 3rd day, all 7 children were following Priya around the construction site like a small feathered parade. She gave them jobs, small ones, holding clips, passing tools, carrying light panels that weighed almost nothing in Teshin's low gravity. They took to the work with a seriousness that would have been funny if it were not so heartbreaking. These children needed something to do, something to focus on, something that was not the memory of burning skies and lost homes. On the 4th day, the boy with the cracked crest, whose name was Tielen, showed Priya something remarkable. He placed both hands flat on the ground, and the bioluminescent patches on his arms began to glow in a slow pulsing pattern of soft blue light. The other children joined in, and suddenly the ground around them was lit with a gentle underwater shimmer. Priya sat very still, watching. She did not understand the biology, but she understood the meaning. They were sharing something precious with her, something that meant trust. "That is beautiful," she whispered. Tielen's glow shifted to a warmer color, a shade the Velari associated with happiness. His cracked crest rose a little higher. Meanwhile, across the plateau, something else was happening that would change the course of the reconstruction. Elder Korvan had been watching the humans for 4 days, and he did not like what he saw. Not because they were doing anything wrong. That was the problem. They were doing everything right, and it made no sense. Korvan was 212 years old, one of the most respected bioengineers in Velari history. He had lived through 3 political upheavals, 2 natural disasters, and the complete restructuring of the conclave government. He understood how civilizations worked, how power operated, how species interacted across the cold equations of galactic politics. His experience explained the humans. On the morning of the 5th day, he watched a team of human builders disassemble a complete row of 10 habitat units that had taken them an entire day to construct. He approached their team leader, a young man with tired eyes and cement dust in his hair. "Why are you taking them apart?" Korvan demanded. "They were finished. They were functional." The young man wiped his forehead. "We talked to some of the families who were going to live in them. They told us about how Velari homes are supposed to be arranged. The communal nesting areas, the light channels, the way the rooms connect, so extended families can hear each other at night. We built these like human housing, straight lines, separate units. But that is not how your people live. So we are rebuilding them. Korvan stared at him. You are adding days of work to accommodate cultural preferences during an emergency. They are not preferences, the young man said, and his voice was firm. Was gentle, but firm. They are how your people feel safe. If the shelters do not feel like home, then they are just boxes. And your people do not need boxes. They need homes. Korvan walked away without responding because he did not trust himself to speak. He went to the medical section instead, where Dr. Okonkwo was running a clinic for children with radiation exposure. Korvan had come to discuss a technical matter, but he stopped in the doorway when he saw what was happening inside. Dr. Okonkwo was sitting on the floor, surrounded by Velari children. He had medical scanners and treatment devices arranged around him, but he was not using them at that moment. He was handing out small brown squares of chocolate to each child, with a patience and gentleness that seemed impossible for a man who Korvan knew had been working 18-hour shifts since arriving. One child, a girl with burns on her arms, was crying softly. Dr. Okonkwo did not try to make her stop. He sat beside her, placed one hand near hers without touching, letting her choose. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, and though the girl did not understand his words, she understood his presence. She leaned against his arm, and her crying slowly faded. Korvan watched this and felt something crack inside his chest. Later that day, Dr. Okonkwo called an emergency meeting. He had discovered something that changed everything. Velari children, under sustained psychological stress, emit a subsonic frequency, he explained to a room full of human medics and Velari healers. It is below the range of adult Velari hearing, so your people cannot detect it. But our equipment picked it up. It is not just a distress signal. It is actively damaging the developing cranial plates in young Velari. The longer the stress continues, the worse the damage becomes. If untreated, it could cause permanent cognitive impairment in an entire generation. The room went cold. Korvan felt his legs weaken. Known. No one had known. The equipment to detect subsonic biological frequencies had been destroyed in the first wave of bombardment. They had been losing their children, slowly and silently, and they had not even realized it. Dr. Okonkwo was already pulling up data on his screen. We can treat it. We need to develop a counter-frequency that neutralizes the harmful resonance. We can modify standard audio equipment to produce it. I need 48 hours. He did it in 36. The counter-frequency emitters were placed throughout the refugee camps. Small devices that hummed at a pitch no one could hear, but every child could feel. Within hours, the change was visible. The children's crests began to lift. Their bioluminescence started returning. The smallest ones began to play again, something they had not done since the bombing started. Korvan found Dr. Okonkwo outside the medical frigate that evening. The human doctor was leaning against the hull, eating a ration bar and staring at the sky with the exhausted satisfaction of a man who had just won a fight that mattered. I have been a bioengineer for almost 2 centuries, Korvan said. I have studied Velari physiology my entire life. I did not know about the subsonic damage. How did you find it in 4 days? We looked, Okonkwo said simply. We had the tools, and we looked. But why? Korvan asked, and his voice was almost pleading. Why do you care so much about children who are not yours, on a world that is not yours, for a species you met less than a week ago? Okonkwo looked at him for a long moment. Elder, I became a doctor because I believe that no child anywhere should suffer if someone has the power to prevent it. It does not matter whose child it is. It does not matter what world they are on. A child in pain is a child in pain. The universe does not have borders when it comes to that. That night, Dunal could not sleep. He walked the perimeter of the camp and found Colonel Voss sitting on an empty cargo crate, drinking something hot from a metal cup. She looked as tired as he felt. I have been trying to understand your species, he said, sitting beside her. I have failed. Most species do, she said. The three powers that refused us, I understand them perfectly. Resources, risk, political calculation. Every decision they made was rational. Every refusal was logical. He paused. Your response was not rational. No, Voss agreed. It was not. You rebuilt shelters because families told you the rooms were wrong. You developed medical technology for children you had never met. Your soldiers patrol our sky, and your builders sleep 4 hours a night, and your doctor hands out candy to crying children. And none of it makes sense. Voss sipped her drink. What do you want me to tell you? I want to know why. I want to know the real reason your species does this. What do you get out of it? What is the price? Voss was quiet for a long time. The gunships hummed overhead in their endless patrol, and somewhere in the camp a child laughed. A sound that had been absent from Teshin 4 for weeks. We were refugees once too, she said. A long time ago. Lots of times, actually. We have been the ones huddled in ruins, waiting for help that never came. We have been the ones watching our children suffer while the powerful looked away. She turned to Duanel, and her eyes held centuries of memory that belonged not just to her, but to her entire species. Sometimes people helped us, sometimes they did not. We remember both, and we decided a long time ago which kind of people we wanted to be. Duanel sat with that answer in the dark, and slowly his crest rose for the first time in weeks. On the 12th day, the sensors screamed. Lieutenant Commander Kai Tanaka was already awake when the alarm hit, because he had been awake for most of the night, running system checks on the Lullaby's weapons arrays. He had a feeling. It was not anything scientific or logical. It was the old, quiet instinct that lived in the back of every combat pilot's brain. The one that whispered when the air changed and the silence got too heavy. He was in the command chair, with his hands on the controls, before the second alarm pulse fired. All patrol units, Lullaby actual, he said into the fleet channel, his voice as flat and calm as a frozen lake. Contacts at the system edge. 40 signatures. FTL exit pattern consistent with Keth Dominion fleet formation. Battle stations. Across the plateau below, Colonel Voss heard the alarm through her earpiece, and her entire body went still for exactly 1 second. Then, she was moving. All construction teams, secure equipment, and move to shelter positions, she ordered. Medical staff, prepare for possible casualties. Dr. Okonkwo, activate triage protocol 7. She turned to Illyra, who was standing beside her with wide eyes and a crest that had gone flat with terror. Speaker Tesh, get your people underground, now. 40 warships, Illyra whispered. You have 5. I know how to count, Voss said, and she said it with a small, tight smile that was somehow more frightening than the alarm itself. Get your people underground. Trust us. Illyra wanted to argue. She wanted to say that 5 gunships against 40 warships was not bravery, but suicide. She wanted to say that the Velari could not bear to watch another species die for them. She wanted to say 100 things, but Voss was already gone, speaking into her communicator, giving orders with the rapid precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind every single night since they had arrived. Because of course she had. Of course the warships had never been an afterthought. Of course the builders and doctors had not come alone. The humans had looked at the situation, and they had seen what everyone else in the galaxy had seen. A broken world and a beaten people, and a predator closing in. But where everyone else had seen a problem too dangerous to touch, the humans had seen something worth protecting. And they had come prepared to protect it. In orbit above Teshin 4, 5 Valkyrie-class gunships moved into formation. The Lullaby took point, with 2 ships on each flank. They looked tiny against the vastness of space, 5 dark shapes arranged in a pattern that would have made any military tactician in the galaxy shake their head in disbelief. At the edge of the system, 40 Keth warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a wall of displaced energy that rippled across sensor screens, like a stone thrown into still water. Warlord Kreth Vasok stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Burning Mandate, and surveyed the system with the casual contempt of a predator returning to a kill it had already made. He had done this 11 times before. 11 species, 11 worlds, 11 campaigns that had ended with surrender and subjugation, and the efficient extraction of everything useful. The Velari were supposed to be the easiest yet, soft, diplomatic, hollow-boned things that had never fired a weapon in anger. His communications officer opened a broadcast channel, and Vasok delivered his standard subjugation demand in a voice that carried the boredom of routine. He identified himself. He claimed the system. He ordered the Velari to surrender all military assets, dismantle their remaining government, and prepare for population processing. Resistance would be met with extinction-level orbital bombardment. He had done this speech so many times, he could have delivered it in his sleep. When the broadcast ended, his sensor officer made a sound of mild confusion. "Warlord, I am detecting 5 small vessels in defensive orbit over the primary settlement. They do not match any Velari ship configuration." Vasok barely glanced at the display. Mercenaries. Perhaps the Velari hired some desperate freelancers with their last resources. Irrelevant. Send the vanguard. 8 destroyers. Sweep them aside. Warlord, the vessels are transmitting a Terran identification code. Vasok paused. The word Terran registered in his mind as something he had heard in intelligence briefings. A young species from a small system on the other side of the galaxy. Loud, emotional, prone to involving themselves in matters that did not concern them. He had never engaged them directly, and nothing in his experience suggested they were worth worrying about. "Terrans," he said dismissively. "Pest control. Send the vanguard." 8 Keth destroyers broke formation and accelerated toward Teshin 4 in a standard attack spread. They were each 4 times the size of a Valkyrie. Gunship, heavily armored, carrying enough firepower to level a continent. The math was simple, and the math said this would be over quickly. Then the lead gunship opened a channel. Tanaka's voice filled every bridge in the Keth fleet. He spoke in Galactic Standard, and his tone carried the same flat calm he used for everything. Whether he was ordering coffee or telling a fleet of 40 warships that they were about to make the worst decision of their very short future. Keth Dominion Fleet, this is TCG Gunship Patrol Lullaby Actual. You are entering a Terran-protected humanitarian zone. You have 2 options. You can leave, or you can find out why they named this ship Lullaby. You have 10 minutes. On the bridge of the Burning Mandate, Vasok's lieutenant looked at him with uncertainty in his eyes. Vasok dismissed it with a wave of his clawed hand. "Arrogance," he said. "A trait common to species too young to know their place. Kill them." What happened next would be studied in military academies across 3 galactic sectors for the next 200 years. The 5 Valkyrie gunships did not retreat. They did not scatter. They did not do anything that the Keth tactical computers had predicted. Instead, they accelerated directly into the approaching destroyer formation at a speed that should have been suicidal. The Keth opened fire. The space between the fleets filled with energy weapons and projectiles, and the destroyers' targeting systems locked onto the 5 small ships with the confidence of machines that understood the mathematics of overwhelming force. The mathematics were wrong. The Valkyrie ships moved through the barrage like water flowing through a net. They did not dodge in the conventional sense. They predicted Tanaka's patrol had been monitoring the Keth fleet's communication frequencies since the moment they had arrived in the system. They had spent 12 days analyzing Keth weapons, signatures, targeting algorithms, shield frequencies, and command protocols. They knew how the Keth fought better than the Keth did. And then the electronic warfare began. The Lullaby broadcast a cascade of signals that tore through the Keth destroyer network like a scream through a quiet room. Targeting systems crashed and rebooted, and crashed again. Navigation computers fed false data to weapons officers. Shields flickered and dropped and came back at wrong frequencies. 2 destroyers, their navigation systems feeding them identical false coordinates, turned into each other at combat speed. The collision was silent in the vacuum of space, but on every sensor screen in the system, it bloomed like a terrible flower. A third destroyer, its weapon systems hijacked by electronic ghosts, opened fire on the burning Mandate itself. The flagship's shields held, but the bridge crew stared at their own allies' weapons fire, with a horror that had nothing to do with damage, and everything to do with the sudden understanding that they were not fighting a fair battle. They were not fighting a battle at all. They were being dismantled. The Lullaby itself killed 3 destroyers in 90 seconds. It moved through space with a precision and aggression that seemed almost personal. Tanaka did not waste shots. He did not make dramatic passes. He identified weak points, and he hit them, and ships died. It was not graceful. It was not elegant. It was the combat equivalent of a surgeon who had decided that the disease needed to be removed immediately and completely. 4 minutes after the engagement began, 8 Keth destroyers were debris. The remaining 32 ships of the Keth fleet held position. Vasok stared at his tactical display, and for the first time in 11 campaigns, in 11 conquered worlds, in a career built on the absolute certainty that the strong devoured the weak, and the weak accepted it, he felt something cold settle in his chest. The 5 gunships reformed in front of the debris field. They were undamaged. And then a new set of contacts appeared on the long-range sensors, emerging from FTL on the far side of the system. 16 warships, each one significantly larger than a Valkyrie gunship, each one broadcasting Terran identification codes. The TCG 4th Rapid Response Carrier Group had arrived. They had been repositioning since the day HAG-7 was deployed. Colonel Voss had authorized the silent escort before she ever set foot on Teshin 4. She had not told anyone. She had not needed to. It was standard protocol. When humans sent builders, they also sent someone to make sure the builders could finish their work. The carrier group's commander broadcast a single message on all frequencies. P. The Velari are under our protection. Test that statement at your own discretion. Vasok looked at his tactical display. He looked at the debris of his vanguard. He looked at the 5 small ships that had destroyed 8 of them. His destroyers in 4 minutes. He looked at the 16 new warships that had appeared, as if the universe itself had decided he was not welcome here. For the first time in his career, Warlord Kreth Vasok gave the order to withdraw. The Keth fleet turned and jumped to FTL, and the system was empty again. In the command center on the plateau, Illyra watched the sensor display as 40 red dots became 32 dots moving away, became nothing. She watched until the screen was clear, and then her legs simply stopped working. She fell, and Colonel Voss caught her. The human woman held the Velari leader steady with arms that were stronger than they looked, and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Illyra pressed her face against the human's shoulder and wept, and above them the Lullaby completed one more patrol sweep across the sky it had claimed as its own. Somewhere in the refugee camps below, a child who did not know what had just seen happened in orbit above her world, looked up at the dark shapes moving across the stars, and felt safe. She did not know their names. She did not know what they had just done. She only knew that the shapes had been there every night since the humans came, and that every night she slept beneath them, the nightmares were a little less terrible. She turned back to the building, clipped on her shirt, the one the kind human soldier had given her, and her bioluminescence glowed, the soft warm color of safety. 3 months later, the sky over Teshin 4 was blue again. Not the exact blue it had been before the war. That blue was gone forever, burned away with the coral forests and the old world, and the innocence of a species that had believed the galaxy would protect them if they were kind enough, and diplomatic enough, and quiet enough. But the new blue was beautiful in its own way, scrubbed clean by atmospheric processors, and healing slowly, the way all wounded things heal. Not by returning to what they were, but by becoming something new. Illyra stood on the observation deck of the rebuilt government tower and looked out at a world she barely recognized. Where the bombed ruins of the capital had been, a new city was growing. It was unlike anything that had existed on Teshin 4 before, and unlike anything that existed on Earth. The buildings were part human engineering and part Velari coral growth architecture, modular frames of steel and carbon fiber laced with living coral. That the Velari bioengineers had cultivated to grow along the support structures. The result was something that looked almost organic, as if the buildings had grown from the ground rather than been placed upon it. The humans had built the bones. The Velari had grown the flesh. Together they had created something neither species could have made alone. Elder Corvan had spent the last 6 weeks working alongside Dr. Okonkwo on a joint research paper about the subsonic stress damage in Velari children and the counter-frequency therapy the humans had developed. It had been submitted to the Galactic Medical Archive the previous week, and within days it had been downloaded by researchers from 47 different species. Corvan had received more professional inquiries in 1 week than he had received in the previous decade. He found Okonkwo in the medical center packing equipment. The medical frigates were preparing to depart, and Okonkwo was carefully boxing instruments, the methodical attention of a man who treated every tool as something sacred. "The paper is being called groundbreaking," Corvan said from the doorway. Okonkwo looked up and smiled. "Your contribution made it groundbreaking. My contribution was just the equipment." "That is not true, and you know it." Corvan stepped into the room and stood across from the human doctor, who had become something he had not expected when this began, something he would have said was impossible, 2 centuries of experience, something he could only call a friend. "The approach was yours. The insight was yours. I had spent my entire career studying our biology, and I missed what you found in 4 days." "Fresh eyes," Okonkwo said. "Sometimes that is all it takes. Someone looking at a problem from the outside, without assumptions." "It was more than that, and we both know it." Corvan paused, and his old crest, faded with age, but still capable of expression, rose to its full height. "Because you cared. That was the difference. You did not study us as specimens or subjects. You studied us because our children were hurting, and you could not tolerate that." Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out 1 last bar of chocolate and handed it to Corvan. "For the road," he said. Corvan took it and held it like it was something far more valuable than candy. Across the plateau, Sergeant Priya Anand was trying to say goodbye and failing completely. The 7 children stood in a line in front of her, their crests bright with color and their bioluminescence active and vivid in a way it had not been when she first found them behind that pile of construction materials 3 months ago. Tielen, the boy with the cracked crest that had since been treated and was healing well, stood at the front of the group, holding something in his small hands. He held it out to Priya. It was a building clip, the same type she had given him on that second day. He had attached it to a thin cord woven from shed crest feathers, each one contributed by a different child. 7 feathers, 7 colors, braided together into something that looked like a tiny rainbow. Priya knelt down and took it, and her hands were shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice broke on the second word. Tielen stepped forward and pressed his forehead against hers. It was a Velari gesture of deep familial bond, the kind shared between parents and children, between those who had chosen each other as family. His bioluminescence flared a deep warm gold. The other children joined in, pressing close, their small glowing bodies surrounding the human soldier who had carried them on her shoulders and taught them to build with their hands and given them something to do with their fear besides drown in it. Priya held them and did not let go for a long time. When she finally stood and walked back toward the shuttle, she did not cry. She made it all the way up the ramp and through the cargo bay and into the small bunk area at the back of the ship before the tears came. Then they came all at once, hard and hot and unstoppable, and she pressed the feathered cord against her chest and wept with a grief that was also somehow joy. In the camps below, Tielin's bioluminescence dimmed to a pale blue that the other Velari recognized immediately. It was the color of missing someone, of absence, of a space in your life where warmth used to be. His mother held him close and said nothing, because there were no words in any language for this particular kind of sadness, the kind that comes from loving someone who has to leave. The other children dimmed too, 7 small lights fading together. They would stay that color for 3 days. Colonel Voss was the last human to leave the surface. She stood with Illyra on the landing zone as the final shuttle was loaded. The gunship patrols had been reduced to 2 ships on rotating station, enough to maintain the protective perimeter until the Velari's own defense systems could be rebuilt. The Keth had not returned. Intelligence reports suggested that Warlord Vassok had been executed by his own superiors, not for losing the battle, but for the humiliation of retreating from 5 ships. "Will you be all right?" Voss asked. Illyra looked at the new city growing on the plateau, at the hybrid buildings and the restored water systems, and the children playing in streets that had not existed 3 months ago. She looked at the sky, where 2 human gunships still traced their patient paths through the blue. "We will be different," she said. "But yes, we will be all right." Voss nodded. She extended her hand one last time, and Illyra took it and held it, and neither of them wanted to let go, but both of them knew that the universe was full of burning worlds and breaking people, and the humans could not stay in one place when there were others who needed them. "Thank you," Illyra said, "for everything, for the shelters and the medicine and the protection, but mostly for the way you did it, for asking what our homes looked like, for handing chocolate to frightened children, for treating us not as a problem to be solved, but as people to be cared for." Voss squeezed her hand. "Take care of your people, Speaker Tesh. They are worth it." Then she was gone, walking up the ramp with the steady stride of a woman who had done this before, and would do it again, and would never stop doing it as long as there were people in the dark who needed someone to come. The shuttle lifted off, and Illyra watched it rise until it was a point of light among the stars. 1 week later, she stood before the Galactic Diplomatic Forum. The chamber was enormous, a vast amphitheater designed to hold representatives from every recognized species in the known galaxy. The Sholung Collective was there. The Mavati Accord was there. Of Concord was there, finally present after months of silence. Hundreds of other species filled the tiers of seats, watching and waiting. Illyra walked to the central podium, and she did not look small. She did not look broken. She looked like a woman who had stood in the ashes of her world and watched strangers rebuild it with their bare hands. She spoke clearly and simply. She described the Keth attack. She described the damage. She described the refugee crisis, and the dying children, and the desperation of a civilization on the edge of extinction. Then she described what she did next. She described the formal requests for aid sent to 3 galactic powers. She described the Sholung Collective's refusal. She described the Mavathi Accord's offer to preserve their culture as a memorial. She described the Assembly of Concord's silence. She gave dates and reference numbers and quoted the exact diplomatic language used in each refusal, because she wanted the record to be precise. The chamber was very quiet. Then she described the humans. She described the message that arrived in under 2 hours. She described 12 ships dropping through the clouds. She described builders who tore down Finnish shelters because they learned that the rooms were wrong. She described the doctor who handed out chocolate to crying children and who discovered a silent plague killing an entire generation, and who cured it in 36 hours. She described a sergeant who sat in the dirt with 7 orphans and gave them building clips and carried them on her shoulders. She described 5 gunships that faced 40 warships and won. She described Colonel Voss catching her when she fell, and saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. The chamber was completely silent now. Not a single delegate moved. Ilir looked out at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, the powerful and the cautious, and the indifferent and the afraid. Delivered her final words. We asked the galaxy for shelter. The galaxy debated. The humans sent builders, medics, and a gunship patrol. And when the darkness came for us, it was not the galaxy that stood in its way. Draw your own conclusions. We have drawn ours. She stepped down from the podium and walked out of the chamber, and behind her, the silence held for a very long time. The address was archived in the Galactic Diplomatic Record, where it would remain accessible to every species for as long as the record existed. Within one standard cycle, 7 species formally requested humanitarian partnerships with the Terran Continuity Government. Within 3 cycles, that number had risen to 22. Within a year, the TCG Humanitarian Command had become the most requested aid organization in the known galaxy. The humans responded to every single request the same way. Send coordinates. We are on our way. On Teshin 4, the coral was growing again. Along the steel frames and carbon fiber supports of the new buildings, pink and gold and luminous, reaching toward a sky that was blue and clear, and watched over by 2 silent ships that asked for nothing in return. In the rebuilt orphanage in the new capital, Tielen slept beneath a solid roof, with walls that curved the way Valari walls were supposed to curve. In a room connected to other rooms, so he could hear the breathing of the children around him. On his shirt, clipped to the collar, was a small, colorful building clip that a human soldier had given him on the 2nd day. His bioluminescence glowed softly in his sleep, the color of safety.